For our gospel reading, we heard a passage from the Gospel of Mark where Jesus had sent out his disciples 2 by 2 to go to nearby towns and villages. And it says Jesus gave them power to cast out demons. They went out, and after a while it says that they preached that people should repent. They cast demons out of people. They anointed sick people with oil, and they healed these people. And after a while they came back, and they were all worn out from all that traveling around. And we heard how there was a big crowd around Jesus. They couldn't get any rest. And so Jesus said, let's all go out somewhere where it's deserted, where there's nobody around, and y'all can get some rest. And so they went there, but the multitude of people saw them going and followed them. And when they got there to the deserted place where Jesus had thought they could get some rest, here was this crowd of people. And you would have thought that Jesus might have been mad about that. He wanted them to go out and rest, and here was this crowd of people. But instead of being mad, it says that Jesus had compassion on them and began to teach them. There are a number of other places in the Gospels that talk about Jesus having compassion. Matthew chapter 9 says, Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing every sickness and every disease. When he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep without a shepherd. In Matthew chapter 14, it says, Jesus departed by boat to a deserted place. When the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot. When Jesus went out, he saw the great multitude. He was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus and his followers were coming into a city called Nain. And it says, behold, when he came near the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, do not weep. And then as it goes on, Jesus raises the young man from the dead. But notice that Jesus had compassion on a woman that had lost her son. It's not only Jesus that had compassion. Other places in the New Testament talk about it. One of the most familiar is the parable of the prodigal son. A young man asks for his inheritance early. He gets it, he goes and squanders it. And when he's broke and dirt poor and starving to death, he goes back to his father. And it says that his father's outside and sees him coming down the road. It says that when the father sees him coming down the road, it says he had compassion on him. From the New Testament book of James, we hear, behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endured. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. There are many other Bible verses that speak of God's compassion. And so since we're supposed to be like God, we're supposed to have compassion also. I want to leave talking about compassion for a minute and start talking about love. We've talked in here before about love in the biblical sense, and we've seen how it does not refer to a feeling or an emotion. Love in the biblical sense is an action. It's what you do, not what you feel. You act lovingly to someone. You treat other people with love. In the biblical sense, love is not a feeling or an emotion. It is an action. But unlike love, compassion in a biblical sense is actually a feeling. It's an emotion. And literally that word is translated compassion means to be moved in the gut, to be moved in the stomach, in other words. It's something you feel in your body. It's not necessarily physical pain, but it's something you feel. And so in contrast to love, which in a biblical sense is an action, compassion actually is a feeling. Now there are a number of places in the Gospels that tell us to love one another. That doesn't tell us to love one another in an emotional sense. It tells us to act with love toward one another. You can't command a feeling. I mean, I can't help, I guess, the way I feel toward somebody, but I certainly can help the way I act toward them. Now, we're supposed to be like Jesus, and since Jesus was compassionate, we're supposed to be compassionate. But how can you command someone to feel a certain way? You know, we look at the biblical definition of compassion. It means to be moved in the gut. Now I want us to look at the modern psychological definition, the emotional response when perceiving suffering and an authentic desire to help. That's compassion. The emotional response when perceiving suffering and the authentic desire to help. Another modern definition of compassion is pain at the pain of others. In other words, you feel a sense of pain when someone else feels a sense of pain. And that's not very far from the biblical definition. It's something you feel in your gut. And so if you feel a sense of pain when other people feel pain, that's compassion. Now obviously we're not talking about physical pain. We're talking about emotional distress or something. Now, since Jesus had compassion on people, and since we're supposed to pattern our lives after him, we should have compassion on people too. But how can you do that? Well, we go back to where Jesus commanded us to love one another. Whether we feel like it or not, he commanded us to act with love toward one another. And it turns out that actions lead to feeling. If you want to feel compassion towards someone, and if you want to feel love toward them, the way to develop that is to start acting with love to them and acting with compassion to them. And if you do that over and over again, you'll find eventually that you actually feel that way towards them. Do you want to be a compassionate person with a desire to help? Then start helping people. Start being compassionate. Don't worry about how you feel about them. Just be compassionate. Act compassionate. Act loving. And then pretty soon, the feelings will follow. And you see how that's connected with Jesus commanding us to love one another? Don't you think Jesus realized that even if we don't feel loving towards somebody, if we act that way toward them, eventually, pretty soon, we'll begin to feel that way toward them. We'll have compassion. If we help them enough, we'll soon find that we want to help them. Now, going outside the Christian realm to secular research, it has demonstrated tangible benefits of being compassionate. Now, a study was done at the University of British Columbia. It involved children around 2 years of age. Children were given treats themselves, and they were given the opportunity to share those treats with others. And the study found that when the children shared the treats with others, it increased their measure of happiness more than receiving the treats themselves. In other words, the children who shared the treats exhibited more traits of happiness than the children who refused to share. A worldwide study done at Simon Fraser University shows that the amount of money spent on others is highly correlated to our own sense of well-being. In other words, people that spend some of their money on benefiting other people have a better sense of themselves being happy and feeling good than people who keep all of their money for themselves. And this is true not only in wealthier countries like the United States, but also in poorer countries like in Central and South America and in Africa. People who share with others in need, in other words, tend to be happier themselves. Now, what I found most interesting was a study done jointly by the University of California and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It was a medical study that looked at levels of cellular inflammation. And cellular inflammation has been linked to some of the most dreaded diseases like heart disease and cancer. And it is usually higher in people under a great deal of stress. And so these researchers started studying the levels of cellular inflammation in people and correlating that with happiness. Now they started out thinking, okay, happy people are going to have less cellular inflammation. And the results that they observed showed that they were only partly right. Happiness was associated with lower levels of cellular inflammation, but only on the people who felt happy because they lived what researchers titled a life of purpose and meaning. People who reported feeling happy because they lived the good life, that is, that they had lots of material possession, spent a lot of money on themselves and things, did not have lower levels of cellular inflammation, even if they reported they were happy. But the people who lived a life of meaning and purpose and reported that they were happy because they lived what they perceived to be a life of meaning and purpose, helping others, were the ones who showed lower levels of cellular inflammation. When happiness comes from being kind and considerate of and responding to the needs of others, you have lower cellular inflammation. If your happiness comes from going out and buying a new BMW or something like that, you don't. So this study indicated that it's not necessarily happiness per se that has health benefits, it's how you get that happiness. And another interesting thing that I thought was fascinating is that psychologists tell us that compassion is inborn in us. They have done studies on infants as young as 3 months old, and they have determined that even a baby, if it detects someone around it that it can reach out to in some kind of distress, will attempt to soothe that person by patting or stroking that person. Even an infant will try to do that. 3-month-old babies will respond differently to the person that the baby observes helping someone than to a person who is hindering someone. So if mother and daddy are standing around the crib changing a diaper and they're fussing and carrying on, the infant knows it. But the point is that compassion and empathy are inborn in us. We are born to be compassionate people. And to a certain extent, this stays with us even as adults. Studies have shown that when we see someone in a bad situation, our first instinct is to help them. That's our first instinct when we see someone in a bad situation, is to help them. And because of that, some have called compassion our first instinct, because it's inborn in us. It may very well be the first instinct that we exhibit in a social setting as babies. And even as adults, it remains our first response. We are not wired from birth to be uncaring. We are wired from birth to be caring. Compassion is inborn in us. It is implanted in us by God. We do not have to learn to be compassionate. We are naturally compassionate. What happens is that we learn to be not compassionate. And studies have been done on children, and they say that sometime up around the years 1 to 16 months, children are learning situations not to be compassionate. And so the inborn compassion begins to diminish around a year or 16 months as we learn to be not compassionate, as we are taught to be not compassionate. Now, no one really knows how this happened. There's all kinds of opinions about how we have been taught to become not compassionate. And I guess the opinion that, someone expresses is their opinion based on their preconceived notions. If I want to get away from preconceived notions and go back to things Jesus talked about, Jesus commanded us to love one another, as we've talked about before. He commanded us to act lovingly towards other people. If we want to relearn and recover our natural sense of inborn compassion, maybe the first thing we need to do is start acting lovingly toward people. And maybe that's how we cultivate that natural inborn feeling of compassion. Act lovingly toward people. We may not feel compassion toward someone, but if we act with compassion toward them, maybe, just maybe, after a while, we'll relearn our natural, instinctive compassion. And there's another teaching of Jesus to go to if we want to relearn how to have our natural compassion. Jesus said, "Judge not." Jesus told us in no uncertain terms not to judge other people. You know what happens when we judge? When we see someone in a bad situation and we're judgmental toward them, aren't we really saying that the reason they're in that bad situation is their own fault? And if we see them in this bad situation as a result of their own fault, isn't that prime ground for us not being compassionate? After all, if they dig their own hole, aren't they just reaping what they sowed? And so if we judge them and say the reason they're in this situation is their own fault, that can make us not be compassionate. They're just getting what they deserve, so why should I be compassionate? If we took the command of Jesus seriously, though, and didn't judge these people, and then we did not have the associated feeling that them being in the situation is their own fault, they're just getting what they deserve, maybe we could have compassion. And so if we want to cultivate compassion in our own lives, I think we can glean two possibilities from the teachings of Jesus. One, we act with compassion whether we feel it or not. And two, no matter how we feel, we refrain from judging. If we can do those two things, maybe that will put us back on the track to recovering our natural, inborn compassion.